Welcome to Books vs. Movies, the podcast where I set out to answer the age-old question, is a book really always better than the movie? I'm Lluvia, an actress and book lover based out of New York City, and today I will be talking about the Scott Pilgrim series of graphic novels by Bryan Lee O'Malley and its 2010 adaptation, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Hi everyone. So I have a lot to talk about today, and I think it makes sense. I mean, I'm talking about a series of 6 graphic novels, and obviously there's going to be a lot of changes because you're not going to be able to fit every single thing that happens in every single one of those graphic novels into the movie. So that being said, there are a lot of differences, and so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I do want to say, this episode might get a lot of hate because I myself hate the movie Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I said it. I know it's very beloved. Most of my friends love it. Like, they love this movie. They ride or die for this movie. They go hard for this movie. And I never understood why. I watched it with them several times because when it came out, they loved it and they wanted to watch it all the time, and I did. And I kept my feelings to myself because they loved it, and I didn't, they loved it, and I didn't want to take that joy away from them of watching it. But it's been long enough. It's been 14 years since the movie came out. Friends that are listening to this, I think it's time I really do not like this movie. So why would I review this? Good question. So I watched Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which is the TV animated series that came out in 2023. And I was kind of just curious about it. Because I really don't like the movie. I wasn't expecting to like the animated series, but I was pleasantly surprised. And I was like, okay, well, I really do not want to talk about the movie. I was like, you know what? I feel like I need to challenge myself and watch the movie. And, I'm going to have to talk about things that I don't like on this podcast, I feel like sometimes. And I feel like I also need to talk about more popular things because some of the stuff I've talked about isn't so well known. So, I want to make sure I'm expanding my reach here. But yeah, so I was like, you know what? I'm going to challenge myself. I'm going to watch it, see how I feel about it. And so let's get into it. Have my feelings towards this movie changed? We'll find out. How did I feel about the graphic novels? We'll find out. So let's get started. So the Scott Pilgrim graphic novels, it's a series of 6 graphic novels. The first one was published in 2004, and the last one was published in 2010, the same year that the film came out. So yeah, it took a span of 6 years for all 6 graphic novels to be published and released out into the world. The graphic novels follow Scott Pilgrim as he navigates life. He's in a band. He's a bass player for the Sex Bob-Ombs. He dated the drummer of the Sex Bob-Ombs when they were in high school, but now he's currently dating Knives Chow, who is 17 and in high school herself at the moment. Then he meets Ramona Flowers, and he is instantly smitten by her, and he wants to be with her. So they do eventually get together, but in order to be with Ramona and have that happy ending that he so wants to have with her, he needs to fight her 7 evil exes. And that's what he sets out to do. Each graphic novel is dedicated to different aspects of the relationship, as well as, actually not just the relationship, it focuses on different aspects of Scott's life in general. His relationship with Ramona, his relationship with Knives, his relationship with his friends, and trying to find a job, and all, things that any 22/23-year-old would need to go through. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is the 2010 adaptation of the graphic novels, and it follows a young man who must defeat his new girlfriend's 7 evil exes in order to win her heart. And yeah, it sounds like it's pretty faithful, and it's actually quite different. And like I said, a lot of this, I can understand why the differences were made, because obviously to include every single detail that's in every single graphic novel would have made this this movie is already about 2 hours long, and they fit in 6 graphic novels into this 2-hour long movie. Yeah, there's a lot in here. And the graphic novel, even though there's 7 evil exes, there are 6 graphic novels because one graphic novel, so 2 of the seven evil exes are twins. So he does fight the twins at the same time. So that takes place in graphic novel number 5. So then number 6 focuses on evil X number 7. So let's get into it. I think this is definitely going to beat out After We Collided in terms of length. I feel like this is going to be my longest episode. We'll see if I'm right, but I have a feeling because I'm just looking at my notes. Like, I even showed Orlando my notes yesterday, and I was like, these are my notes for Scott Pilgrim versus the notes for every other book that I've reviewed. And he just like turned around in shock because it's a lot of notes. So anyway, let's get into it. I will say there are some things that did not age as well, and I'm definitely not one of those people that believes in like canceling something that hasn't aged well, anything like that. There are some things that are like overtly offensive and should definitely be canceled, and then there's some things that are like, that is definitely a reflection of its time, and that's all it is. We know better now. We don't need to cancel something from the past. So I do want to say that there are definitely some things that did not age as well. And one of them is the fact that Scott Pilgrim is a 23-year-old in the movie. He's 22 in the graphic novels, but he does eventually turn 23 through the course of the series. This is a 20-something-year-old man dating a 17-year-old high school girl. It is uncomfortable in the graphic novel, don't get me wrong, but the film, oh my goodness, the film, like rewatching it, me and Orlando were just like, this is really icky, and especially the way not only Scott but like his friends talk about this 17-year-old girl and whether or not they've like had sex already. It's like, you guys, why are like none of you calling him out? And like, this movie came out when I was 19 years old. So even as like watching it back then, like I was like, oh yeah, he's 23 dating a high school student. Like I did not think anything of it. But now, 14 years later, like I was just like, this is really uncomfortable. I don't like this. And I don't like the way they're talking about this 17-year-old girl and what she and her 23-year-old boyfriend have done together. Like, this is so gross. It was really uncomfortable watching it. So that was something that it is uncomfortable in the graphic novels, but like the film definitely like amps that feeling of like, this is really icky. Can we drop this subject? Like, this is not okay for a man of this age to be dating this little high school girl. So anyway, that was just really uncomfortable. But I will say, so the way I handled this was obviously because the library did not have like the big edition with all the graphic novels in it. Like, it didn't have that edition. I had to read each graphic novel individually. So the way I tackled this was I would read one of the graphic novels and then just watch the part of the film that corresponded to that graphic novel. So the first hour of the film is dedicated to graphic novels 1 and 2. And I want to say out of that hour, the majority is graphic novel number 1, which makes sense because we need most of what's found in graphic novel number 1, since it is a lot of setup and backstory that we need to meet these characters. So a good chunk of that hour is dedicated to just the first graphic novel, and then I want to say it's like 45 minutes of the first hour is graphic novel number 1, and then the last 15 minutes of that hour are graphic novel number 2. And then I will say the ones I get like then on, it happens so fast. It's just like the battle and then it's over, which is I think one of the reasons why I didn't like this film. Like, it just got so repetitive to me. It's like, okay, we get it. You have to fight 7 evil ex-boyfriends. Like, we get it. Move on. But anyway, so yeah, so like I was literally timing it. Graphic novel number 3 took up 10 minutes of the film. Graphic novel number 4 and number 5 each took 5 minutes of screen time, and then the last however many remaining runtime of that is graphic novel number 7. So yeah, like graphic novels 3, 4, and 5, but especially 4 and 5 just get like completely forgotten. Like, you don't remember them. They don't exist, pretty much. So anyway, just wanted to say that Scott's ex-girlfriend, who is MB Adams, we end up finding out that she's dating Ramona's evil ex number 3. But anyway, in the film, it's revealed pretty early on that she's his ex-girlfriend. In the graphic novels, we don't, like, she's hinted at. People keep, like, mentioning, like, oh, Scott's evil ex, Scott's evil ex. But she's not revealed until the very end of graphic novel number 2. It's one of those, like, that's how it ends. It's, like, one of those, like, did you miss me kind of moments? And he's like, oh my gosh, it's you. And we see, like, her. So, yeah, she's revealed very early on in the film as to his ex-girlfriend is, but it takes a little bit more time in the graphic novels to reveal who she is. And again, because I think so in the first graphic novel and in the film, ex-boyfriend number 1, he sends Scott a notice saying, we're Ramona's 7 evil exes, we're gonna fight you, and blah, blah, blah. I will be the first one you fight, all of that. And it's very interesting because obviously since the first graphic novel came out all the way back in 2004, Scott receives this notice from Matthew Patel, that's the name of the first evil ex. Matthew Patel sends Scott a letter, like a handwritten letter sent through snail mail that Scott opens up and he's like, oh, this is so boring. So by the time Matthew Patel shows up and he's like, what do you mean you didn't read my letter? Scott was like, But anyway, it's so funny that the film came out in 2010. And so they updated it that instead of snail mail, Scott receives this letter through email. It was just something that I noticed because it's like, wow, what a difference 6 years make. 6 years ago, Scott received this letter via snail mail, and 6 years later, he's getting it via email. And again, the pacing of the film is just so fast. Again, because it makes sense, there's a certain amount of things that they can squeeze in during the runtime. Like, they have to keep it within a certain runtime. So, like, it's just so fast. And the books obviously are a lot slower. It takes longer to develop things. And the film, it's just like wham, bam, boom, bang. But, like, it's just so fast. Like, it moves so much faster. So I'm going to move pretty quickly. As I said, there's just too much to talk about. Too many events that happen in the graphic novels that don't happen in the film. Again, makes sense as to why there is a lot cut. The focus is just on the battles. But in graphic novel number 2, when he fights Ramona's evil ex number 2, Lucas Lee, he fights just Lucas Lee. In the film, he actually fights Lucas Lee's stunt doubles first before he fights Lucas Lee. It's one of those things that probably happened to make, because these fights are already going so fast, it was just to really expand on the fight and make it a little bit longer, because they could afford to do that, I guess, because like fights with number 4s and number 5 and 6 are just so limited. But yeah, so he actually fights Lucas Lee's stunt doubles in the film, but he does not fight them in the graphic novels. But fun fact, those are apparently Chris Evans's real stunt doubles that Michael Cera fights in the film. So that's, I don't know, I thought that was interesting. So after he fights Lucas Lee in the film, Evil X number 4 appears to Scott and is like, I challenge you to a fight. And then they don't actually fight because she's number 4. But she makes an appearance. So we see who Evil X number 4 is before we get to the fight with Evil X number 3. In the graphic novel, it is not revealed who Evil X number 4 is until her corresponding book. So that was interesting. That one, I wasn't quite sure why that change was made, especially because she says like, oh, we're gonna fight, but then they end up not fighting anyway since she's number 4 and he has to fight number 3 before he fights number 4. So I don't know. That was just something that I was like, why are we introducing her already? Is it just to throw us off? I don't know. But that one was kind of just like interesting. And then, so once we get to Envy Adams and Evil X number 3, again, the graphic novel focuses a lot more on Scott's relationship with Envy and how that really took a toll on him. It's hinted at in the film, but it doesn't go into as much detail as it does in the graphic novel. So in the film, she actually invites them to be the opening act, but in the graphic novels, they just kind of show up to watch the show. Like, she does invite them personally to watch the show, and then she asks them backstage, and that's where the battle happens. But this is kind of when all like the major changes between the graphic novels and the film started happening. So there's actually a line that Todd, who's Evil X number 3, says, and he says, I'm not afraid to hit a girl, I'm a rock star. So at this point, Knives is a 17-year-old girl, Scott is dating Ramona, and she's still like really infatuated with him. So she keeps hanging out with him in his group, which is another thing that I was like, why are all of you like 20-something-year-olds still allowing this 17-year-old girl to hang out with you? That's just weird. But anyway, so Todd says, I'm not afraid to hit a girl, I'm a rock star. And he does in fact hit Knives so hard that it like knocks the highlights out of her hair because she's kind of being annoying essentially. And in the graphic novel, it's Lynette, who is the drummer of the band, that punches Knives. And that's mainly because it turns out that Todd is cheating on Envy with Lynette. So there's this whole thing. The way he is defeated in the film is that Scott gives him coffee with half and half in it. So Todd is vegan and he drinks this coffee with half and half and he doesn't realize it has half and half. And then the vegan police show up and take away his vegan card or his vegan powers, because in this universe, if you're vegan, you have like telekinetic powers. So the vegan police show up and take away his telekinetic powers. In the graphic novel, Todd is actually knowingly eating meat, or at least he's knowingly consuming food that isn't vegan. So he calls himself vegan, but he's not actually vegan. And then that's when the vegan police show up. And it's interesting because in the graphic novel, the way Scott gets over Envy, his ex, is that Envy and Ramona actually fight each other. This fight does not happen in the film. Scott Pilgrim just fights Evil Ex number 3. But in the graphic novel, Envy and Ramona actually have a fight. And the way that Ramona defeats Envy is there's a way that if you touch Envy in the back of her knees, it makes her go weak in the knees. And it is essentially a very orgasmic feeling for her. So Ramona does this knee touch to the back of Envy's knees, and she's able to defeat Envy using that trick. If you're a fan of the film, you will notice that I just described how Evil Ex number 4 is defeated. So yeah, in the film, since there is no fight between Envy and Ramona, they passed Envy's weakness on to Evil Ex number 4. So Ramona is the one that's like, do this to Evil Ex number 3 and it'll make her melt. And that's how Scott defeats Evil Ex number 4. So yeah, that was, I think it's just a really funny weakness, and I feel like the filmmakers wanted a way to keep that in, but since there's no fight between Envy and Ramona, they switched that weakness over to Evil Ex number 4. But yeah, I was reading this and I was like, wait a minute, that's not how we defeat Roxy. So Roxy is Evil Ex number 4. So how does Scott defeat Roxy, since it's not through the power of the weak knees? So in graphic novel number 4, Knives' dad is actually out to kill Scott because of the way he treated his daughter, and it's his daughter's first boyfriend, and just a lot of like overprotective dad kind of reasons. So the big fight does still involve Roxy, but there's another big fight that involves Knives' dad, who's out to get revenge on Scott for everything that's happened between him and his daughter. So as he's trying to kill Scott like just pushes Roxy into the battle. And so Roxy and Knives' dad start fighting. And meanwhile, Scott is like, what do I do? Like, how do I defeat this person? So yeah, Scott is having this conversation with Ramona, kind of just like, what do I do? And Roxy calls him out for not like fighting her himself, and Ramona is like, yeah, you're kind of like weak. And so Scott's like, I'm not weak. And this is actually the first time in the graphic novels that he tells Ramona that he loves her. So he says he loves Ramona and earns the power of love, which manifests itself into a sword, and he fights Roxy. He actually cuts her in half. And it's silly, fun graphic novel, so it's not like bloody or gory in any way, but he cuts her in half, and that's how Roxy is actually defeated in the graphic novel. So yeah, it's really interesting because the change they made there. In the film at this point, he hasn't told Ramona that he loves her, or he's not in lesbians with her, as he says. So yes, he does not defeat Roxy through the power of love. The power of love comes into play later during his fight with Gideon. But in the graphic novel, this is the first time that he says that he loves Ramona, and he uses the power of love to defeat Evil Ex number 4. And it also makes sense why he's able to say he loves Ramona at this point. As I said, the film just happened so fast. I want to say the film happens, it's got to be like a matter of days or hours, actually. So of course he's not going to be in love with Ramona. He's infatuated with her, yes, but he's not like in love with her at that point. But the graphic novels take place over a course of a year. So by the time he fights Evil Ex number 4, like he's been with Ramona for a few months. So he probably does legitimately feel love for her. In the graphic novels, Scott actually fights Evil Exes number 5 and 6, the twins. he fights them twice. In the film, he only fights them once. As I said, fight with Roxy and the fight with the twins only take up 5 minutes of screen time each. So we're really trucking along here on the film. But in the graphic novel, he does fight the twins twice. Once he fights them at a party that Julie is throwing. Julie becomes the party house to the point where she and her roommates have so many parties that people are kind of getting bored of all the parties happening at her place. So the first time he fights the twins, it's at one of the parties. I think it's like a Day of the Dead party, actually. So they fight him at this party. He loses, obviously, so he has to fight them again. And then the second time, he fights them specifically to be able to remain in a relationship with Ramona. In the film, as I said, this entire sequence of the twins takes a whopping 5 minutes. He meets them. They have a battle of the bands. So they fight against each other, battle of the bands style. And Scott ends up beating the twins at this battle of the bands. So again, because the graphic novels take place over the course of a year, by the time we get to graphic novel number 5, Scott has moved out of Wallace. Wallace is his gay roommate, played in the film by Kieran Culkin. So he and Wallace live together in a tiny little studio apartment. Everything belongs to Wallace. Everything, like the bed, the furniture, everything belongs to Wallace. He lives in this tiny little studio with Wallace. But in the graphic novels, there actually reaches a point where Wallace is like, I found a bigger place and I'm moving into it. And I don't think you can afford the rent. And I love you, but I kind of don't want you to move in with me. And Scott is like, that's fine. I think I want to move in with Ramona. And Wallace is like, great. I was hoping you would say that. And Scott and Ramona actually end up moving in together and have their own little apartment. So yeah, throughout the year that Scott and Ramona have been together, Ramona actually starts growing out her hair. It gets pretty long and she has a conversation. At this point, like I said, Knives has been hanging around Scott and his friends for a while, even though she and Scott are no longer together. So again, it's like, why are you guys allowing this little 17-year-old girl to hang out with you guys? She can't do any of the stuff you guys are doing because she's not of age, but okay. But she continues hanging out with his friend group. And at one point, like, she's pretty much over Scott at this point, but not completely. But she reaches a point where she talks to Ramona and she says, oh, I'm not mad at you anymore for taking Scott away from me. And so in the film, before Scott fights Evil X number 7, Knives shows up and starts fighting Ramona. And she says, like, you took him away from me. You stole him. You cheated. And Ramona's kind of just like, or you made him cheat on me or whatever. And then Ramona's like, you cheated on me? And he's like, no, I cheated on her with you. And Ramona's like, is there a difference? And then that's kind of the end of it. Like, there's really no, like, that's it. There's no consequences. She says that and it doesn't affect her in any shape, way, or form. In the graphic novel, as she's having this conversation with Knives, she finds out that Scott was with the two of them at the same time, so he cheated on them. And she takes this really, really hard. And at one point, while they're in bed, she asks him, like, did you cheat on me with Knives? And that's when he says, no, I cheated on Knives with you. And she takes that really, really hard. Scott is like, whatever, he's half asleep. So he knocks back down. He doesn't realize that this is haunting Ramona. So she actually goes into the bathroom and cuts her hair short again, the short hair that is kind of Ramona's signature. And when Scott wakes up, she's sitting with her short hair in bed and he's like, what's going on? And she says, I don't think this is gonna work out. And she disappears into the ether. And Scott was like, what do you mean? And that's how it ends, with her breaking up with him. And then the graphic novel picks up where that left. So Ramona has disappeared. No one knows where she is. So he's going through this really difficult breakup and he's taking it really, really hard because he really, really loved Ramona. And so we see in the first couple of pages that he's not coping very well. And little by little, he starts finding ways to get up out of bed and move on from her little by little. They do break up in the film, but in the film, she breaks up with him because she can't be away from Gideon. She breaks up with him because she essentially goes back to Gideon. So in the graphic novels throughout this series, starting around graphic novel number 4, Joseph, who is the lead guitarist and one of the singers for the Sex Bob-Ombs, he meets up with Kim's roommate. So Kim has a roommate, and this roommate is like, oh, I know how to record an album. And he's like, great, we're going to record an album. And he becomes obsessed with recording this album that the Sex Bob-Ombs stop practicing. And again, this happens over a course of several months. So it reaches a point where it's like, what's going on with the band? And he's like, we're recording right now. And it's like, but we're not doing anything else other than focusing on this album. So it reaches a point where Kim is like, I think I know what I want to do, and I want to move back home to like with my parents. So she initially lived in Toronto with Scott and the rest of the people from Sex Bob-Omb, but then she moved away and then she came back. So she wants to leave and go home with her parents, and she actually does this. So by the time we get to graphic novel number 6, Kim isn't really around anymore. She's moved back, and Sex Bob-Ombs, by the time we get to graphic novel number 6, is pretty much non-existent. So in the film, obviously, like, Scott realizes that Gideon offers the Sex Bob-Ombs a record deal, and they take it, everyone except for Scott, because Scott's like, no, like, you took Ramona from me. And then young Neil steps in and replaces Scott as the bassist. But this does not happen. There is a new band that forms by the end of the graphic novel. It's no longer the Sex Bob-Ombs or the Sex Bob-Omb or Sex Bob-Omb, whatever. But yes, the Sex Bob-Omb as a whole, as a band, still has a important role to play during the battle against Gideon Graves, who's Evil X number 7 in the film. But in the graphic novel, Sex Bob-Omb actually is no more by the point Scott comes to fight this guy. So Gideon opens up this huge club, and since he just signed Sex Bob-Omb is like the inaugural show in the film. It's the inaugural like opening band. But in the graphic novel, since Sex Bob-Omb is actually no longer existent, it's an NB Adams show. He's the inaugural opening night show for this venue that Gideon is opening is actually an NB Adams solo project. So she is signed to Gideon Graves' label, and so she's the opening show for this nightclub. And yeah, so by the time this happens, Scott hasn't seen Ramona in a few weeks, maybe even a few months or a couple of months. It's not really clear. We just see like the passage of time, like I said, through his grief of the relationship being over, and then him slowly picking up the pieces and putting his life back together after this very devastating breakup. And he like moves out from the apartment he shared with Ramona, and he moves into his own place. So yeah, the Ramona ends up appearing when Scott battles Gideon Graves, because there's like rumors floating around that Ramona and Gideon have reunited and are a couple again. And this is, as I said, the case in the film. But in the graphic novel, that's not what happens. She actually disappears to kind of go work on herself a little bit and kind of just realize what she wants, who she wants to be as a person. And when she comes back, it's like, I want to be with you, Scott, and I'm going to help you fight Gideon. And like I said, in the film, there's a battle between Scott and Gideon, and there's a battle between Knives and Knives and Ramona. But by the time this final graphic novel rolls around, Knives is completely over Scott. So she does not get into a big fight with Ramona. And I wish that this had been kept for the film, because in the graphic novel, once Ramona is like, I worked on myself and I know what I want, and she and Scott essentially get back together right before the battle with Gideon. She's the one that teams up with Scott to fight against Gideon. In the film, it's Knives and Scott that team up to fight against Gideon, which I'm just like, you reduced Ramona's role so much for Knives. And I get it, like, it's a much shorter time span between in the film than there is in the graphic novels. But I like that Scott and Ramona are the ones that fight Gideon together, because it just makes more sense. Like, Knives has no reason to fight Gideon other than, Scott apologizes and said, you're not mad at Ramona, you're mad at me for breaking up with you and cheating on you and all this stuff. And Knives is like, you're right, so I'm going to team up with you and help you fight Gideon so you could be with Ramona. I just liked so much more that in the graphic novel, it's Scott and Ramona that team up and fight this guy together. In the graphic novel, Ramona actually dies. Gideon kills her during his first battle against Scott and Ramona. And so Scott, there's this bit in which Scott does die again in the graphic novel and in the film during his battle with Gideon. And it's during this that he meets Ramona in the ether, and they talk, and he says, I can't believe you broke up with me to be with this guy. What's great about this guy? And Ramona says, he has a way of getting into my head. And Scott's like, oh, well, okay. And she's like, no, I literally mean he has a way of getting into my head. And she turns around and there's like a microchip that essentially makes, I guess you could say it's like mind control, like Gideon, like this makes it so that Gideon can kind of control her. Like he doesn't physically control her, but he can control how she feels. So he keeps making her feelings towards him come back, so she's unable to like get over him. And so it's during this conversation in the ether that Scott comes back to life. So he uses the power of love and Gideon kills him. And then as he's having this conversation with Ramona, she says, I think you're fighting for me, but you should be fighting for someone else. And it kind of rewinds me, go back to Scott walking into the club and all of that. And then he pulls out, once he gets to the second fight with Gideon, it's Scott earned power, self-respect, and he pulls out the sword of self-respect as opposed to the sword of love. And Scott still has one life token that he earned earlier in the film. So that's how he comes back. But this change also really, really bugged me because in the film, after Ramona dies, Scott is like, I'm going to figure out a way to bring you back to life. And he goes into her purse, and her purse takes him into her mind, where Gideon is in there and all like the different versions of Ramona are in there. And he's like controlling the different aspects of Ramona. And the way I interpreted that, maybe this is not what Bryan Lee O'Malley intended when he wrote this, but the way I interpreted it was, it wasn't literal mind control the way it is in the film with that little microchip. That Gideon inside her mind is the toxicity that you can have with someone in a relationship. And having been in a similar relationship myself, I'm like, it's one of those things that's like, this person is bad for you and you shouldn't be with them anymore, but you also kind of can't help. They find ways to hook you back in each and every time. And that's kind of how I interpreted this Gideon inside of Ramona's head, where it's like this relationship that she doesn't want to be in anymore, but he finds a way to, so Ramona reinvents himself as expressed by the different Ramonas in her mind. So there's like different phases of Ramona's life, and those are no matter how much she changes and herself and grows as a person, Gideon finds a way to lure her back in. And that's the way it is sometimes in a toxic relationship until you find the strength within yourself to break that cycle. And that's kind of what happens in this situation. So Scott goes in, he does fight Gideon a little bit in Ramona's mind, but ultimately it's the different facets of Ramona that team up and defeat the Gideon in her mind, and reflecting the breaking of the cycle. And that's what brings her back to life. And she and Scott team up after this and together defeat Gideon. As I said in the film, Scott defeats Gideon by himself through the power of self-respect. And then Gideon, after he's dead in the film, he releases Nega Scott and says, can you defeat yourself? And so Scott has to fight Nega Scott, but he ends up befriending Nega Scott. And Ramona walks away and says, like, I can't do this. I just hurt people all the time. And Knives is the one that says, go be with Ramona. Like, you fought to be with her this whole time. Like, go be reunited with her. It's okay. And then Scott walks away and he holds hands with Ramona and they're together happily ever after. So yes, those are like the big changes that I have time to talk about myself between the graphic novels and the film adaptation. Oh boy. So yeah, like I said, that change especially really bugged me. And like I said, maybe this was not the graphic novelist's intention with having to head into Ramona's mind and seeing Gideon in there as the mind control. I really did not like this change in the film, because when you're in a relationship like that, you don't need a microchip implanted in you to keep coming back to that person. It's a cycle that you have to learn how to break yourself. And I loved the imagery of Ramona reaching that point and being able to do just that, to finally be with the person that she wants to be. And she learned that through that break that she and Scott. Knives had a bigger role in the film than she does in the graphic novels. In the graphic novel, she's still important, but she's definitely a lot more like, I hate Ramona, like I have so much beef with her because she's still my boyfriend for me, which makes sense. She is a 17-year-old kid and 17-year-olds think that way, unfortunately. So that made perfect sense. What I really liked about the graphic novels is that each major character grew, which is not something that really happens in the film. Like, yes, Knives grows after Scott apologizes to her, but I really, really do not like the fact that Knives is the one that fights Gideon with Scott. Because there's no reason for her. Like, I understand that she needed that closure from Scott in the film because she hasn't gotten it at this point. She has gotten it in the graphic novels by the time he fights Gideon, but she hasn't gotten it in the film. But I wish that I wish that they had kept Ramona being the one in the final battle with Gideon. And especially because we see that little microchip break. During the battle, there's like this explosion that like causes her to fall down the stairs and the microchip breaks. And that's how she's able to break out of Gideon's mind control. Again, don't like that it was a microchip in the film. Like, I wish they had really kept it the way it is in the graphic novel because I really appreciated the symbolism of that, or what I interpreted that symbolism to be. I just feel like it's a lot more powerful to have Ramona, like, if that's what that microchip represented in the film. At the end of the day, like, it breaks and she doesn't join the fight. It's still Knives and Scott doing the fighting. And Scott is the one that delivers the final blow. So yeah, Scott grows a little bit, I guess, in the film. He earns the power of self-respect, which is like great, I guess. But there is not the level of growth that there is in the graphic novels. So I think it's pretty obvious that you can tell my feelings for this film have not changed. I still really, really do not like this film, and this will probably be the last time I watch it unless I go over to one of my friends' house that really loves this film and they want to watch it. I will continue letting them like what they like, and I will sit there and watch it or be on my phone. But me, myself, this is the last time I am watching this film, and I'm glad this is the last time I have to sit through this because I still really, really do not like it. I will say I had a hard time getting into the graphic novels myself. I felt like all the characters were awful and unlikable in graphic novel number 1. I did not like any of them. I didn't like Ramona. I didn't like Scott. Knives I had a little bit of sympathy towards just because she's, again, a 17-year-old kid, and the way she was thinking made sense with the way high school kids think. But like all of them, I was the main group of characters. I did not like them. I did not care for any of them. I hated them. I was like, what did I do to myself? This is gonna be absolute torture. And then as the graphic novels went on, I found myself liking it a little bit more as each graphic novel passed. The story got better and better and better for me. And at the end of the day, I truly appreciate the growth that all the characters. I love that Knives matured from this little 17-year-old kid that was upset at the woman who took her boyfriend away and realizing, I don't need you, Scott. I have a bright future ahead of me, and the peace that comes with that. And Scott, he's still not my favorite character, I will admit, but he does go through this growth after most of his growth comes in that last novel when he realizes that he and Ramona broken up for possibly good. And so he having that relationship that he really, really cared about for the first time in his life, and just how much that took out of him, and picking up the pieces and becoming a better person through that breakup to the point where he realized he does really still want Ramona, and he can be with her now in a mature, more healthy way than what it was before, where it was more just infatuation and legitimate love, but he still had a lot of growing up to do. And Ramona, how it hurts me what they did to her in the film, because in the film, she is a stereotypical manic pixie dream girl, just there to lift up Scott, not go through any major journey of her own. So if you're not familiar with what a manic pixie dream girl is, it's essentially a young woman in usually films that is kind of quirky, kind of eccentric, like Ramona, and they don't do anything. They're usually one-dimensional, like Ramona in the film, and they're just there to provide support for, usually it's the love interest, but it can be a non-love interest. It's just the protagonist. Or she's there to help him grow as a person, but she herself does not get anything in return. She's just there to be quirky and provide support to the protagonist. That's it. That's Ramona to a T in the film. And I hate that because she goes through this beautiful journey on her own where she doesn't go back to Gideon. Yes, in the film it's explained that she's going back to Gideon because of mind control. In the book, like, she breaks up with Scott and she disappears and she does not go back to Gideon. She goes off on her own to discover what she wants. She realizes what she wants, and that person, she thinks what she wants is Gideon, but instead of reuniting with him, she goes off on her own and discovers that it's not Gideon that she wants. It's in fact Scott. So she goes through her own emotional journey to the point where she teams up with Scott to fight this guy that has been haunting her ever since they first started dating, because he's a toxic person that she just cannot let go. And she realizes she doesn't want that anymore. She wants to be with someone who treats her right. And she does that. And even though Scott does go into her mind and helps a little bit, ultimately it's the old versions of Ramona that say, we're done with you. We don't want you in here anymore. And they break that cycle. And I just, like I said, I relate to that so much. And for them to do Ramona dirty like that and just make her a stereotypical manic pixie dream girl in the film is just like Ramona in the film is so boring. She, like, I remember all my straight guy friends had crushes on Mary Elizabeth Winstead as Ramona. Okay. And she is very, very pretty. Can you tell me what she does other than be pretty and hot? Nothing really. She doesn't do anything in the film other than be Scott's love interest. And that really, I hate that they did that to Ramona. Ramona deserves better. Ramona deserves better. And you know what? Okay, I think that's why I liked the animated series, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, because Ramona is the focus. She's actually the protagonist of the animated series, despite having the Scott Pilgrim name. She's the protagonist, and it makes up for what they did to her in the film. So, the winner is clearly the graphic novels. I did not think I was going to like them, especially after reading the first one. I did not like the first graphic novel at all. I didn't really like the second one. And then the third one was okay, and it just got better and better and better until now I can say, you know what? I didn't mind it. I would read the graphic novel again. Why not? I had a good time. There was funny lines, there's funny moments, and the characters show genuine growth. Something that does not happen in the film. I rated the film 2.5 stars. The graphic novels got an average rating of 3.5 stars. So it's an average rating of 3.5 stars for the graphic novel. Film 2.5. I still think you can skip it. I still don't see what the big deal is. However, if you like it, you enjoy it, it's a comfort watch, keep enjoying it. This is just my opinion. I am not here to tell you to stop watching it. This is more like if you haven't seen it, you've been curious about checking it out, I don't know, maybe you will like it. I would personally recommend the graphic novels and the animated miniseries Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. I will say I did enjoy the little Easter eggs in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. For example, they're making a film called Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, which is actually the name of the first graphic novel. And Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life is essentially Scott Pilgrim versus the world. Like, they're making the movie that exists in the real world, and it is directed by Edgar Wrong, which is a play on Edgar Wright, who is the actual director for Scott Pilgrim versus the world. And the really cool thing about the animated series is that they actually got all the original actors to voice the characters. So Michael Cera is back as Scott Pilgrim, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, all of that. I say this film is a skip 1,000,000,000 times %. My opinion of this film has not changed. This was my first time watching it in about 11 or 12 years, so it had plenty of time to maybe grow on me in that time. It hasn't. Still don't like the film. I was telling Orlando that after I read the first graphic novel, I was like, Scott Pilgrim is the worst. He's so unlikable. And so Orlando was like, oh, so they cast Michael Cera accurately. Michael Cera, if you're listening to this, I have no issue with you. I know Michael Cera is actually kind of like very hated, it seems like. I don't know why. I personally don't have any issues with him. I feel like he fit the character pretty well. I mean, Mary Elizabeth Winstead is good for what she's given, but like I said, she's not given much. Ramona Flowers really sucks in the film. Justice for Ramona. I mean, it's an all-star cast. A lot of these cast members went on to become bigger stars than they were at the time that they were cast. So like Kieran Culkin, Anna Kendrick, Aubrey Plaza. Yeah, they're okay, I guess. But yeah, they're not. I mean, there's nothing really that they're fine. Kieran Culkin is funny. Everyone is fine, but nothing like that. I don't know. If you have nothing nice to say, don't say nothing at all. So I'm just going to leave it at that. And it has nothing to do with the actors' performances. I just really don't like the material. Okay. So, and I do want to make a correction because earlier I said Joseph is the drummer, and not the drummer, is the guitarist / singer of Sex Bob-Omb. It's not Joseph. It's Stephen Stills. Stephen Stills is the singer / guitarist of Sex Bob-Omb. He hooks up with Joseph to make this album in the graphic novel. I remembered there was a Joseph. I don't know why Joseph. I think it because it's just Joseph, and that's why the name came to me, but I just wanted to make that correction. It's actually Stephen Stills, who is the guitarist / singer of Sex Bob-Omb, and Joseph is the one that helps make Sex Bob-Omb's first album. But yeah, that's it for this episode of Books versus Movies. I hope you enjoyed it, and I apologize to any Scott Pilgrim fans out there. Just remember that these are my opinions. You're allowed to like it, and I would hope I don't have to say that disclaimer. If you're a friend of mine, you should know that you're still allowed to like it. But, sometimes people just take this so personally and are like, how dare you not like this thing that I like? That means you don't like me. And it's like, I never said anything about you. I just said I don't like this thing that you like. So anyway, I just want to say, if you like it, if you love Scott Pilgrim, the film, keep enjoying it. I will stick to watching the animated series and reading the graphic novel. This episode of Books versus Movies was edited, recorded, everything done by me. It would really mean a lot to me if you would help me grow my audience by leaving a rating and a review and sharing it with your friends. Let them know that this podcast exists, and I will talk to you next time. Next time I will be talking about A Long Way Home by Saru Brierly, and its 2016 adaptation Lion, starring Dev Patel and Nicole Kidman, directed by Garth Davis. See you next time.